back at DIGFM. It's one of the first things I did when I joined beeswax was do a presentation here. It was my only time at the wedge before the wedge was no more. So yeah, it's good to think back to those different times. But yeah, great to be here digitally as well. So today we are going to talk about web UI with Java and JavaScript with FileMaker. We're going to feature a open source product called bzBond as well. As I think most of you know now, and it says on the slide, I'm Alec Gregory. I'm Senior Engineering Manager at beeswax. Sorry. My phone is helping me today, but it doesn't always stay connected with the presentation. So extra bit of fun. Okay, so a little bit about me before we get started proper. So I've been a FileMaker developer since 2008. I've been in many different roles within the community. So I started off as an in-house developer. I then pretty quickly moved on to be a consultant, and then geographically moved to New York to work for a vertical market product. Followed that up by moving into nonprofit, and that was then geographically in San Francisco. And then finally I found hopefully my forever home at beeswax in 2019, so almost 4 years now with beeswax. And in beeswax, I'm mainly working the enterprise team, so the larger clients. Technically, my specialization is integration. So that's web integration, but all sorts of integration. I've done XML, QuickBooks, Tableau, Airtable, Keynote, just to name a few. This Keynote was not in any way integrated. I work a lot with web technologies, mainly the core technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. That's probably my main interest outside of FileMaker, those technologies. Recently, I've been working a lot on dev tools for use on client projects. So as projects mature, they tend to need tools to keep them ticking over more efficiently. So building those, commissioning them from others. And as I've moved into a management role, I've started managing fairly small interdisciplinary teams, which I really enjoy. So those teams typically made up of FileMaker devs, project managers, web devs, data analysts or data scientists on the Tableau side, and designers. Yeah, so I'm very excited to work with people with lots of different skills and bring them together to come up with a cool product. So agenda for today, who knows, to be honest, if we're going to cover all of this, and but this is the hope. So we'll have a quick look at web UIs and JavaScript, a little video that some of you may have seen. Weirdly, the video just seems very loud. I mixed it down lower after what my first test was too loud, but when I just tested it now, it seemed to really clip through the audio. So maybe just be ready to pull your volume down when it comes in. Apologies if it blows anyone's speakers. Then we'll take a step back, just look at where we are with Claris web integration tools and where we've been. We'll then look at something I'm calling the web integration cycle, which is a workflow for managing web integrations in FileMaker apps. Then we'll look at the open source product, bzBond. We'll do a quick overview of it, and then we'll look at it in a bit more detail in the context of the web integration cycle. That part of the presentation is quite detailed. It was very hard to know how much detail people would like. So I'd say, as a kind of questions point of view, if you want more detail on something, maybe I'm happy to give it. The other thing to say is there's full documentation for this product already. So anything, you don't need to be concerned about missing anything. There's much more thorough documentation available. I'm just trying to bring out the main interesting points. So if you think something could be expanded on, feel free to raise that as a question. I don't know if you can somehow, if I'm really, if you're flagging, if it's not working, try and let me know. As I said, sometimes hard to stop, but worth a try. We'll then look at a kind of discrete feature of bzBond, which is using JavaScript in FileMaker scripts. There's a few novelties there that people may be interested in. I'll do a quick note about the open source nature at the end, and then we'll do a recap. Okay, so let's get into it. So we're going to watch a video now, and the video basically shows what you might create in FileMaker with a web UI, and then it may be, it's supposed to tell a story. I did it fairly quickly. I'm not sure if it tells the story, so I'm going to tell the story after the video as well to take some pressure off. It's supposed to show what you might create with web UI in FileMaker and why. So here it comes. It's very short. All right, that was the vid. So hopefully that gave you a flavor of the sort of stuff you can create with web UI in FileMaker. So I'm just going to briefly summarize it because it's short. There's fairly quite a lot of movement. You may have missed some of the things I wanted to highlight. So what was it? It was essentially an embedded animated bee catching game. So you saw bees flying around, and the idea was you catch them with your mouse. Why? What was the kind of business purpose behind it? Well, maybe you saw at the beginning, perhaps a disengaged worker or a worker who was a little fed up in their job. So the idea was to maybe engage and stimulate workers whilst keeping them in the system, of course. Why did we use web for this particular section of the app? The main, I think this was pretty obvious, the main reason is that animated interfaces cannot easily be built with the other FileMaker layout tools. So it's not impossible, but it's not straightforward, and there's no real structure for doing it. So that should be fairly straightforward. Now, why was the app integrated into FileMaker? There's many reasons to integrate things like this. There's sometimes reasons not to. The reason this was integrated, or the argument you can make, so you can seamlessly move between the two modes. You saw the move in. The idea is if you press that back to work button at the end, you'd seamlessly move back. You're kind of closer to the FileMaker data. So if you want to collect data from the web app back into FileMaker, that is less of a reach. And you save on the infrastructure side as well. So a lot of integration, especially in larger systems, especially in the enterprise space, a lot of the complexity is not really about development, it's about environment and provisioning. So usually if you're trying to add a feature or add a system, you're going to get further if you don't have to provision new resources. So if you were doing this on a web server, you have to provision a web server. If you're doing a web integration in FileMaker, any IT environment is going to see that as the same app. as your FileMaker app, so less overhead on that side. Okay, that's enough of that. All right, so how could we get to the sort of thing that we see in that video, and when did it really become possible? And before that, what were we doing? Those are some questions I'm going to try and answer in this section. It's a fairly short history. It does not necessarily do justice to everything it mentions, mainly for reasons of time to research and time to cover them, but hopefully it gives an overview. So first I'm going to look at the web viewer object itself and how it's progressed. And this is very simple. Essentially, when we're talking integration, up until FileMaker 18, we had really one option, which was allow interaction with web viewer content. That meant you as a user could click into web viewers, depending on the content in them, you could type into them and do other interactions with them. Then in FileMaker 19 or Claris 40 plus, we got an extra integration option, which was allowed JavaScript to perform FileMaker scripts, and that was via a little function called FileMaker perform script. And that is much more of an automated integration option. The clue is in the name, script. Script in FileMaker usually means automation. So that's the web viewer options side, and this is how integrations actually happened over the years or over the versions. So initially, if you wanted to get your web viewer to talk to FileMaker, you would use the FMP URL script protocol. You basically build the URL and use the open URL script step if you needed to. Or sorry, you wouldn't do that because it would be a web viewer, so you just click the URL or you'd force it using JavaScript. If you were in FileMaker and you wanted to communicate or refresh or sort of sneakily update a web viewer, you could use the calc engine directly, or you could use it more indirectly and update a portion of the URL and trigger a message that way. Now, those things, all of them were a bit awkward to deal with, and it felt like you were working against the platform in some senses. Fortunately, there were some really good tools that came out to make it a little easier to do integrations. One was a beeswax tool, FM Ajax. There was the FileMaker Web Viewer Bridge, which I think was the Geist tool, now Proofgeist, of course. And then there was Claris FM, which was a little bit more full-featured in that it also had kind of integrations built into it, but it was essentially the same underlying technology, was to make this kind of integration easier, and that was from Reliant. I'm sure there were more, I just wasn't as active in the space then, so I missed them. Okay, so when we get to FileMaker 19 and Claris 40, the methods become more direct and you feel more like you're supported in integration activities. So if you want to if you want to communicate with FileMaker from a web viewer, you now have a very direct way. Two functions, FileMaker perform script, which was quickly superseded by FileMaker perform script with option, which is a little more flexible. And then from FileMaker to web viewer, again, you have a direct path into JavaScript from the script step perform JavaScript in web viewer. So those tools, I think when they came out, a lot of people thought they would be the end of the story for dev tools in many ways. But it turned out those tools, whilst they're very useful, they also could be enhanced in fairly standard ways, in that people were expecting certain things to be, they were expecting these new tools to behave in certain ways, and they didn't. So we're going to take a look now at sort of what the tools landscape is looks like in the current iteration of integration. So I've split these into three. three categories. The first thing are the sort of bread and butter enhancements to the Claris tools. So a lot of these are code libraries on GitHub. I'm sure I haven't got close to covering them all. These are just ones I have heard about or used in the past. So we have three GitHub repos, FM Gopher, FM Load.js, and on FM Ready. They handle mainly getting script results back into JavaScript. FM Promise is the kind of outlier there. It does do that. It's a plugin. It's an open source. A free plugin. It also handles running JavaScript in FileMaker, sort of in the FileMaker space, using plugin functions. So tools came out to basically just increase the functionality of those FileMaker tools. I did say here that I'd add a kind of definition of what a promise is, because you see the mention of the word promise, which is a word with a regular meaning. In the sort of web dev JavaScript world, a promise or the promise approach is just a way to handle asynchronous operations in a synchronous way, essentially. That's not technically accurate, but that's how I think of it. Essentially, some things that you trigger from JavaScript have an uncertain endpoint. I think we've all experienced that in FileMaker as well. Say you're doing some command line stuff and it's creating a file and you don't know when the file's going to be ready. So to handle that kind of thing elegantly, JavaScript has this concept of a promise, which replaces the callback concept that it had previously, and it'll essentially say, once this is done, your code can react to it without you having to keep polling for that thing to be done. So that's the functionality that's being added by these enhancements. In a lot of cases, they're saying when your FileMaker script is done, our code will react. So the next kind of category of tool is, obviously there are just implementations based on the tools that exist, and that's really covered by the JavaScript add-ons within the Claris platform. So there's 9 of them that you can see in the screenshot there, and those, those you can dig into if you want and see how they do things, but they're basically just leveraging the tools that add functionality. And then more in the dev tools area, I've highlighted their JS in FM. I see Jeremy's here, which is great. And I feel like that, it's a lot of filling a lot of gaps on the learning side for people who aren't necessarily used to working in JavaScript but do want to use integrations, and also adding useful code, useful tools for handling, authoring UI and integrations. And then finally, not related necessarily to these new FileMaker 19 tools, we have a kind of a more focused set of mainly plugins that run JavaScript in a plugin environment. So the beeswax bbox plugin has a newish function called JavaScript Node. So it can run Node.js JavaScript. Base Elements has had for a long while, the open source plugin has had a JavaScript runtime environment, and the MBS plugin also has JavaScript. So that's nothing to actually do with FileMaker 19. Most of these have pre-FileMaker 19 support, but they're plugin based, right? We know the kind of deal you make when you add plugins. Ooh. Okay, so just to polish off this section, we will just look at the progression at a high level. So two-way integration was what we mean when we say integration. It was possible, but it was hard in the earlier versions of FileMaker. It became easier in the modern FileMaker or Claris ecosystem, but tooling is still required to fully realize the potential of JavaScript. So specifically, accessing FileMaker script results from JavaScript code. There's no obvious way to do that with new native tools, and then accessing JavaScript function results from FileMaker scripts. Again, something you think might be included in the tools isn't actually included in a really easy way. Okay, so that concludes the sort of history section. Let's move on to bzBond and the web integration cycle. So bzBond is a tool that lives in that same space that we saw, that we were talking about. You know, it's definitely related to a lot of those tools that we saw. And I'm going to give you a bit of a kind of overview of it. Then we'll see it kind of in a context of where you might use it in a real integration. So brief history of it. I've been saying a lot of time it's that it's an open source product. Just reiterate that. I think I reiterated it at the end here as well. It's who actually makes it. It comes from the internal beeswax Claris JS working group. So it's just an internal team. Claris, it was kind of formed, and then we advocated for people to join it. And the working group, it has a simple remit. It was to discuss and research how JavaScript and FileMaker can work together. And bzBond, the product, evolved organically from discussions of web integration needs with our devs and our clients and potential standards. So initially, we thought the working group might work on standards for doing integrations, so like published standards and best practices. But the kind of consensus was that actually a product would be more useful. Tools and a product. So and the actual development is done in combination between the web team and the FileMaker team at beeswax, but there is quite a lot of web code in it. We've been using, if not exactly the full library, certainly the code and the principles behind it since 2020. So it's mature-ish, at least the principles and the approaches are. The code base is still moving fairly quickly. We're still in a 0 version. As I say, it's released as open source, and it has been open source. It's been public on GitHub for a little while now. So yeah, that's not something that is coming soon. It's here. Okay, so what does bzBond do, and where does it sort of live in the ecosystem that we've defined? So it provides an end-to-end workflow for managing the web integration cycle. So that's sort of the, I guess, the unique element of it. It does also enhance the Claris web integration tools in ways we've seen. So it provides a promise-based FileMaker script API, and it adds JavaScript functions to FileMaker scripts. It does also add server-side JavaScript, and we'll see how it does that. But that is also fairly novel, I think. Okay, so let's now focus on what I'm calling the web integration cycle, and that is how we might go about handling a web integration in FileMaker. So the first thing is a pretty generic thing, is we'll identify a need which requires an integration. We'll then set about authoring it, and that'll be a combination of web and FM coding. We'll then integrate the web and the FileMaker side together. Then we'll test that, hopefully, and we may need special tools to test it that we wouldn't usually need just for a FileMaker integration. The key there being, with FileMaker, we're used to kind of live development where you could see the results of what you're coding right away. There's a little bit more work required to do that when there's a web integration involved. Finally, we'll deploy the results of our web code, our web authoring into FileMaker. So how is what is the asset or the end result of the code, and how is it integrated into an actual production app. So that's the deployment section. And then we're back, obviously, as maintenance and new features are requested, we're identifying new needs. Obviously, this is stylized. Those sections overlap and switch places and don't always go in a straight line. Okay, so let's look at bzBond in the web integration cycle. So I'm going to try and pull out the main points or the main features of bzBond within this cycle. So the first one is authoring. And as I say, I'm trying to pull out the main points. There is full documentation, so we'll be jumping around a bit. And yeah, if anything is unclear, please ask a question and we'll get to it. So the first route to beginning starting to author a integration, there are two routes in, or two main routes in. First is the all-in-one bzBond app. So this is a FileMaker app which is pre-integrated with a bzBond web project. And you can create that with a single terminal command. Most of this is going to be Mac OS based, by the way. It is also supported in Windows, but just because I don't have easy access to a Windows machine, I've focused most of my stuff on the Mac OS side, but it does work in Windows too. So the command is this. It's just a simple command you can copy and paste. That's a sort of template where it's got app name is the name of your app. So I put a real command in as well there. So that will create you an all-in-one app called My App. It'll have a FileMaker element and a web element. Now, in order for this to work, this npx command and the things it does, you need to have Git and Node npm installed on your machine. The good news is it's fairly easy to install those programs. There's 3 separate components there, but the other good thing is that npm is included with Node.js. So if you can install Git, you can install Node, you'll get npm. And as I say, they're just regular installers you can download and run. So nothing too scary there. Okay, so that's your first route in. If you take that route and go for an all-in-one app, so that's basically a new FileMaker file and a new web project, you'll see this sort of splash screen open up in FileMaker. And this is a interactive splash screen. So the middle section of this screen is interactive. The whole thing you can update live. So this is basically the live coding environment. What we're seeing here is a web viewer. If you have VS Code installed, you can open the code file in the code project in VS Code by clicking the button. And if you're using a different text editor, you can just update the project main file to change this in real time. So this is just a bit of a sort of reassurance that the kind of full stack of the authoring is working. The second route in, and this is probably going to be a more common one, is if you want to add an integration to an existing solution, like you've got a big solution and you're adding a web integration, certainly that's much more common than being able to start fresh. So to do that, you would install the bzBond add-on into your FileMaker or Claris file. And then rather than running the full command, you would run the command with the web-only flag. So the web-only flag essentially does not create a FileMaker file, does not open a FileMaker file. It just creates the web portion. And then you would manually integrate using the bzBond Web Project Manager, which we'll see in a moment. You'd manually integrate your web app into your existing FileMaker solution. And the reason for the manual integration is we don't want to, in an automated process, assume how your existing solution is set up. So it's safer to not try and mess with it. So this is the web project manager that I mentioned. It's a fairly simple interface for storing web code. The code itself might look a bit sort of unapproachable, but you don't need to worry about it. You never have to interact or decipher the code in that format. But yeah, you'll see on the left, it's a kind of list detail layout. On the left is the list of projects. On the right is the source code for the particular project. Just to kind of be complete, here is the script payload. A fair amount of scripts, but a lot of them are extremely simple. And a lot of them are handlers, and they're in their own little folder anyway. Then finally, there is a small schema overhead, which is just a single table for storing web code. Okay, so then you can start coding your web integration. And here's an example of some code in VS Code from that bzB app. Okay, so something else I wanted to add here was that all the kind of bzBond web projects that get created, they are created as Git repos. I would definitely recommend that you use version control, use Git, use GitHub. It's the most common UI for Git. So yes, I would recommend using Git to manage your web code. The main reason for that is that web code, especially in FileMaker, is just very hard to track traditionally. So things would, often web integrations would be made and then not touched for a couple of years. The code would be indecipherable. Maybe the dev who wrote it was a web dev and left, or someone, they were just starting with web code and then they didn't touch it again, and it was hard to come back to. So they tended in the past to make solutions fragile. The idea here is to properly, take advantage of the tools we have, which are great in the web community, to track your product and allow safe development by doing things like branching, where you can safely create a new version of your web project without endangering the work that's already been done. So it's not easy to learn Git, unfortunately. There are front ends you can get for it, as I mentioned. There's GitHub, which is the biggest one. It's worth your time to do so. Oh, that's weird. We have some backwards animation, but there you go. So you automatically get a Git repo, so do try and use it. Okay, so let's get into integration. And that is, how do we get our web code and our FileMaker code talking? So we first have to set up a web project. We need to tell FileMaker that we have some a web project that we need to integrate. Every web viewer that bzBond is linked to a bzBond web project. So that's kind of a non-negotiable part of the library. If you have a web viewer, it has to look back at a web project in the web project manager. That's where they're stored. And every web project must have a name. The name, like the author names we were discussing before, has to be unique. The system will not allow, or the validation is set up not to allow duplicate names. If you want to deploy your integration in production, which like 99% of the time you do, you'll also need some source code for the integration. So this is an example of the web project manager entry for the bzB's app that we saw at the beginning. The name and source code are both populated, so it's ready for production. Okay, so we have our web viewers, or at least I've told you we have them. We have our web projects, you've seen those. How do the two get linked together? So how do we get that web project code into our web viewer? We do it with config. So config is JSON based, and within the config for a web viewer, there is a web project property which links a web viewer to a web project in the web project manager. So here's an annotated example of config for the bzB app web viewer. You'll see it's a JSON object with a sort of nested objects within it. The top level is the layout name. That's just the name of the layout where the web viewer happens to be. This is bzBs is what I call my layout. The next layer is the web viewer name, and then the final within the web viewer name, there's the actual config, and you'll see the web project that I am defining is the bzBs one that we saw in the previous slide. So the reason it's set up like this is there is only one web config object for your entire solution. So it's split up by layout first, and then by web viewer. That usually, unless you've done the thing which you can do, which is create duplicate layout names, please just don't do that. This should ensure that you get the right specificity between layouts and web viewers. So that's the reason we have this sort of nested approach. So how do we define config? How do we work with it within FileMaker? It's usually best to define it in the web viewer setup dialog. You'll see this is the thing we saw a snippet of at the beginning. Here is a modern one. You'll see a peek of the code. And then here is the real definition of the config. So this is a let variable, let function that sets the global variable. And the interesting bit is sort of in the middle. I have this little pointer, great. So we're seeing there the web project, bzBs, but we can add in our own config as well. So we have whatever we like. Actually, the structure is completely up to you, but here I'm seem to be putting some script names in my config as well. We'll see how they are useful. The key thing to note is that you're not returning anything in the web viewer. You're not trying to get the code into the web viewer in the calculation. It's blank. That is a deliberate choice to allow it to control, to allow us to control when the code gets loaded more easily. So here we're just defining the config. As soon as that object becomes active, this calculation will, as soon as this object is on a layout that is loaded, this will evaluate. Okay, so how do we use bzBond in a web project? We've seen a little bit of web code, but we haven't seen any integration code. So the first thing to mention is that bzBond is an NPM package. It's published, it's public. It's installed automatically as part of our web project setup, so you don't have to worry about doing NPM install or anything like that. To use bzBond, you just import it into your JavaScript code. And in the example that we saw, the splash screen, it's already there, so you can just follow that example, but the actual code, importing code is import bzBond from the beeswax organization, the bzBond.js repo, package. And then once you have it, you call functions by just prefixing with bzBond dot and then the relevant function. Again, these functions are all documented in the repo, so don't worry about jotting down their names. Okay, so we're going to cover now the enhancements, which again we've covered what enhancements do. We're just going to quickly see how they're done in bzBond. So this is the promise, how we get FileMaker script results into our web code. And again, this is not a novel part of the library. I just think it's interesting and useful to know. So it's pretty simple. You can use regular JavaScript techniques. Most familiar one is probably promise chaining. So you'll run your JavaScript function, bzBond perform script, give it a script name, a script parameter, and then, literally then, you do something with that result. So in this case, we're running script to run, we're getting the result back, and then we're logging the result to the console. So this is a really simple promise chain. But promise chains can be complex and as long as you like, and they can include non-bzBond based functions. So here we're running a FileMaker script, bzBond. We're using the result of that FileMaker script to run another one. And then it waits, again, the then keyword. Then we're using the result of the second script to run a JavaScript function, which also is returning a promise, which means maybe it's hitting an API externally or something. Once we get that result, we then run another FileMaker script. And then finally, the result of that script is what we're logging in. So I like the promise chaining feels a lot like FileMaker. It's kind of subscript kind of feel to it. So it's kind of intuitive, it's nice. But if you're used to working in JavaScript, it's not a pattern that you want to, it's a bit of a pain because it goes outside of the regular pattern of kind of assigning variables and using those variables. So there is another way, and that's called async await, which again, it's the same thing technically, it's just a different coding approach. They call it syntactic sugar. And this is how it works. So rather than blasting straight in with your function call, you define a function and you say this is an async function. So it's dealing with asynchronous calls, and we're calling it integrate. And you'll see that we're using this keyword called await. So we're doing regular JavaScript variable assignment here. We're saying I am assigning my script result variable, and I'm doing it by waiting for the bzBond perform script function to finish and then taking the result. So here we get the same thing as our simple example, constant script result, and then we log it out. But you see, you have to define a function, then you have to call the function. So it's not, you're doing composition here, right? And maybe you don't want to do composition. Composition is really hard in general. It's one of the hardest things about web development is deciding how you will structure your JavaScript code. And if you're doing something simple, or you just don't want to think about composition, it's tedious to have to do this. You might be thinking, how many functions do I have to do? Do I have to put them in objects? All sorts of things that they're real concerns, but sometimes you just don't want to have to think about them. So there is another way, which is sort of the best of both worlds approach. It's easy breezy way to use async, and it's called an IFI, or an instantly invoked function expression. And this is not specific to promises. It's a regular JavaScript pattern. You can find a lot of literature on it. All we need to know is that if you put this first line, open brackets async, close brackets, blah, 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 and then this last line, which finishes off like it's the wrapper, then you can just use the await keyword without really worrying about it. So you can say, my script result, I want to await for this. Then you can do loads of other stuff. You can do more awaits. You can mix regular synchronous code with asynchronous code. It's a really flexible way of doing things, and for a lot of less complex integrations, or even complex ones, you can get by with just this. Okay, that was a bit of detail. I'm going to move on, but I'm trying to basically highlight key JavaScript concepts as well as key bzBond concepts, because I think the learning journey is always part of any integration, and these are just things that I really wish I'd learned earlier on in my process. So the next thing I want to cover is actually using config in your web code, because we saw how we defined config. We saw we had to have a web project, but we also saw that we defined some other config. So how do we access that in our web viewer? So we use another asynchronous function, bzBond sync config. And in the bzB app, we use that to grab the config, again using this await keyword, and then we use it to perform a particular script which was defined in that config. So the idea behind this really is separation of concerns and avoiding hard-coded references. If in our web code we had to say in advance what script we want to call, you've then got a rather nasty dependency in your web code. And if your FileMaker developer changes the script name, they have to then tell you to change your hard-coded script reference. If you instead just update your config in FileMaker, the website can just grab that config and then run whatever script you've defined. So you still obviously have to coordinate, but the coordination is at a much higher level. You don't have to get in and change script references. I do want to also highlight another cool JavaScript technique, which is really great when you get the hang of it, destructuring. So this script is just returning the same format as the data API. We're reaching in to the response property of that. Then we're reaching down into the data property. And then we're assigning a variable b's to the array that's in the data property. So, it's not a particularly intuitive concept, but once you understand it, it just means you can do a lot more in a single variable assignment. And yeah, that's a really powerful thing to do. Okay, so that may be too much detail. It may not be enough for some of you. I'm going to pull back from the kind of super detail now and just leave some tips on the table. So the first thing I would say is that we haven't gone into the details here. If you want to kind of high level, how do I get my FileMaker data into my JavaScript code effectively? My recommendation is just use the execute FileMaker data API script step, because it returns JSON, and JavaScript has an uncomplicated relationship with JSON. It tends to just work. And if you're using bzBond, it really does just work. You don't even have to do any processing. That said, do all processing of JSON, so by this I mean sorting, repurposing into different objects, filtering, searching, do all that with JavaScript. Don't do it with FileMaker, because JavaScript has an uncomplicated relationship with JSON. FileMaker does not. FileMaker is doing its best with JSON, but I think we'd all agree that it's not the most performant or straightforward part of the platform. So I want to leave here as well a few methods for working with JavaScript arrays. These basically allow you to do all the things you want to do in FileMaker with JavaScript really easily. So you can look those up. You can just look up arrays in general. The sort of stuff you can do is really powerful, and often it takes a single line of code or 3 or 4 lines of code to do something that would take a lot of scripting in JavaScript. Next tip, I'd say take advantage of FileMaker context by basing your web viewer layout on your primary table interest. So in our example, we had a table that includes staff members, Bs. That is the table, that is the context for our layout. The reason this is important is you can use that layout as the basis for your execute FileMaker data API call. So you can say just get layout name is your layout name for your data API call. And remember, this is an internal data API call. You're not going through FileMaker server direct with a token or anything. So you can build a very efficient query this way. It can have relationships if you set it up correctly as well. So you can get a lot of data without leaving your context. A lot of people maybe think of web integrations being outside of the FileMaker context concept, but you can leverage it, and you should leverage it. Cool. And finally, I'd say just explore the web platform before you necessarily reach for a framework. By a framework, I'm talking about React or Vue or various other frameworks available. For big projects, frameworks are really good, and they are worth using. If you're doing something small to get started, you have an opportunity to learn how just basic JavaScript and HTML can work together. And there is actually a lot of support natively in the platform for doing things that you often want to do, such as put data in attributes in HTML and things like that. So for smaller integrations, you can get a long way with core web functions. You won't always end up with the prettiest code, but it's kind of all yours. So it's easier to debug and it's easier to come back to. And the bzB app does use it is a vanilla app. So you can see it's not a particularly attractive code base, but it is fairly succinct and hopefully it shows you what's possible. Okay, so that's integration. Now let's move on to, and these things are a bit less in depth. So we're zooming out a bit of the detailed technical stuff. So testing, there is a local web server. This is kind of par for the course for most NPM-based projects. Just to highlight it really, so you get the dev server, which you can use for live development, testing, debugging. You just run npm start, which is a sort of standard pattern for running a dev server. The key thing I want to highlight here is that certainly in enterprise environments, but I'm sure in other environments too, like maybe your client has a web dev who wants to, or has already designed something. If you're working with people who don't have access to FileMaker or don't want to get involved with it, you can use the dev server for live dev, and then web devs often want to mock the bzBond function so that they can get sort of fake script results and dummy data. So that's a completely valid and supported route of doing things. You do kind of have to do that yourself, but as in the web dev has to do that, but it's almost always worth it to kind of streamline the process, and then the web dev is just worrying about web stuff. They don't have to care about FileMaker until you test it and it doesn't work. But that doesn't happen much. But note, if a web dev is doing this testing, it's just best for them to follow the web browser engines that are in FileMaker. So that means on Mac, use Safari. On Windows, use the new Microsoft Edge. So yeah, that way you'll get the closest performance parity when you switch over to FileMaker. Okay, so integration testing. So that was really covering like if you just want to test the web side of it. If you want to test if the integration is working without actually deploying the code and building it, you can use the web project manager's debug mode. And debug mode is something you can turn on for an individual web viewer or a whole web project. So the distinction there is a web project can be deployed in hundreds, thousands, or just one web viewer. A web viewer is just one instance of a web project. So if you want, you can say all my web viewers I want to kind of debug right now. You can do that, or you can say just this one web viewer I want to debug. So usually you'll do it for a whole project, to be honest. It's easy to do. You just go into the manage debugging popover and say you want to turn on debugging, and then you just enter the URL of your dev server, which you'll see if you ever do npm start, it'll pop up a web browser window with that URL. You can just copy and paste it in, and then instead of looking at this big block of code here, this project looks at that URL. So this code means you have to keep updating it every time you change your code if you're in development. Okay, finally, let's handle deployment. So this is how you store and deploy code. Again, this is a topic that is best covered in the documentation. I just want to give a sense of it here. So the kind of the philosophy behind how code is stored in the web project manager is that portability, including, I guess, offline functionality, and performance are the kind of key philosophies or key principles. To support those principles, all the bzBond web projects are stored as single HTML files. So all of your web code just gets squished down into a single file. There is a script included in the bzBond web project that does that for you, so you don't have to worry about how that is done. You just run the script when you're ready to build your project for production, and then it'll automatically create your single HTML file, always in this location. So whatever your project folder is, there'll be a subfolder called dist, short for distribution, and it'll have index.html in there. And that can just be copy and pasted into the web project manager. There's also, you might have seen a kind of download button if you set up a URL, either local or remote, for your project. It can use just uses insert from URL to get it, nothing fancy. If you're working in production and you're regularly updating web projects, maybe you've also got a dev environment, it might be good to create a custom build script. So that's basically a node script. It's like a shell script really, but in the JavaScript space. And definitely the kind of the tool you want to use on the FileMaker side is the data API there. So you can update something on a remote server really easily using a node app that calls the data API. That might be a fun project if you want to build it, if you're kind of intermediate JavaScript level, you've done some node stuff, but we're probably going to release one in the future. So it's coming. Okay. So just to show what that single distributed file looks like, you can see the document hierarchy. At the bottom, you can see the command that was run to build it. And there's the code. And there it is pasted in the FileMaker. Okay, so we're close, but we're not quite there. How do we get that code into web viewers? We've sort of hinted at it, but we haven't made it explicit. So all code deployment with bzBond is done using a FileMaker script. That script is bzBond load web viewer. It takes a JSON parameter, which basically has a web viewer name as its only required property. So it looks like this in its rawest form. So you have just web viewer as the prop, and then there's your value. bzBs is our example here. There's also a helpful wrapper function, especially useful if you have lots of web viewers on a single layout, or you just always want to be loading the web viewer when you're entering a layout, and that is bzBond load web viewers on current layout. And that will just essentially find all the web viewers and then see if it can find the web project for them. It's a looping script essentially, and its parameters. It doesn't take a web viewer parameter, but it takes all the same parameters as the bzBond load web viewer script. Again, this is all in the documentation, the exact parameters and what they do. And a common pattern is to use the wrapper script, bzBond load web viewers on current layout. You would use that script as part of a script trigger in a lot of cases, such as on layout enter, so that every time you enter a layout, the web viewer gets deployed. So there's an example of that there. So for our bzBs, we have on layout enter and on mode enter as well. Those are set up. I want to highlight a few more properties of that load web viewer script. One is wait for config. So sometimes it's important that the config is definitely available before you continue with the script stack. So think of these scripts, even if they're with triggers, they're running in a kind of, often running in a stack. And when FileMaker is running scripts, it's kind of unclear what's happening with web viewers. A lot of the time they kind of get frozen and don't load. So bzBond tries to take away handling with those issues away from you and abstracting it and giving you basically these options to fix issues where you're not getting the config or you're not getting the web viewer loaded before you're doing the next thing. So one of them is wait for config. It'll just wait until it can find that config object before loading a web viewer and continuing with the script stack. So that would just be an additional property there. And then similarly, there's wait for load, which means wait until the web viewer has loaded and bzBond is callable in it. It's a similar situation. I want to highlight these because a lot of the issues people have with web viewers is that they just aren't loading, or they're loading too often. That's one that's more in WebDirect. And the most common scenario where they're not loading is when the script stack starts in one layout and ends in a layout with a web viewer, and then the web viewer just doesn't quite, the code doesn't deploy properly. So in that case, you would then look into using these properties. But generally, if you're troubleshooting, these properties are a good first point of call. Just turn them on, see if it fixes your issue. Again, full documentation is available for them. Let's just recap. Really, here I was just trying to give some flavor to what bzBond can do and how it can be used in a sort of real world development process. In this case, the web integration cycle. Hopefully, it's I'm not expecting people to follow this exactly or closely, but hopefully you recognize some elements of your own process in here, and you can have ideas for how you might use bzBond or a tool like it to have basically a development process for integrations that fits nicely into your current process. That's the idea, right? Just to integrate. So you're integrating the code, but you're also trying to integrate the development process of web stuff into FileMaker. Okay, we're really nearly at the end. One thing I wanted to highlight was the kind of more of a utility or discrete function, which is performing JavaScript in FileMaker scripts. And what we're talking about here is basically leveraging JavaScript, which is extremely fast for a lot of functions, and basically replacing or augmenting FileMaker's built-in functions or script steps. So a good example of augmenting or enhancing would be doing array or other JSON processing in JavaScript. It's just extremely fast compared to FileMaker. That's fine. An example of adding a feature would be using regular expressions. Regular expressions just aren't supported in FileMaker natively, so if you want to run regular expression on some text, you could do it via JavaScript, which has solid regular expression support. So those are two kind of use case examples. How would you do that? Well, in bzBond, you essentially call a script, which is bzBond relay. You call it as a subscript, and you'll get back the result. Now here, I'm deferring to the READMEs because, for one, I want you to know the READMEs really exist because I've been talking about them a lot. And two, these are just quite involved processes. So I can just skim through this. But the key thing is you'll be saying perform script, bzBond relay, give it some parameters, and you'll be getting back the result. So that's what you want, right? You want to work this into your regular script flow. And this is how you do it. You perform this script with parameters, which we'll look at, and then you get back a result, which is the result of that JavaScript. The result formatting is the same as the data API. We had to do something to, we couldn't just give the raw result back for various reasons, so we decided to mimic the data API result so it responds on messages. And the key thing to note is this will be appropriately formatted. So if you're expecting JSON back, like an array, it'll be a properly formatted array. The library handles that. The parameters then that you call it with, the first one, unfortunately, you can't avoid. It's just the mode for that script you have to say is perform JavaScript. Bit of a pain, but there it is. If you're on the client, you have to either say which web viewer you're performing the function in, or if you don't, it'll assume that you've selected the web viewer you're interested in. If you're on server, you don't have to worry about this because web viewers don't exist on server. Next, you're saying what JavaScript you want to perform. You define the function as a string. It can either be the name of the function that's available in the web viewer at the window level, or more usually, it's a function definition. And that means, you're literally, often pasting from Stack Overflow a function that you want to run. And then you're passing parameters to that function in a separate FileMaker parameter. You're just passing an array of parameters. So that's an example of parameters you might pass, and those will be processed. Okay, and obviously parameters are optional. Not all functions require parameters. And finally, we have this root variable, which allows you to, on the server, handle the function input as just a string of code that you want to run, as opposed to a function defined, a defined function. It's a little niche, but it's useful. And here's the kind of giveaway for how we're doing things on the server. There's two ways you can do it. One of them is, if you want, you can just have the bbox plugin installed on your server, and then just pass a true into this parameter, true in the use bbox parameter, and it will run using the bbox plugin on the server. It'll check first to see if you really have it installed, and then it'll use the JavaScript node function of bbox to run your JavaScript. A couple of examples. So if I just want to do a simple sum function, I would call bzBond relay with my form JavaScript. I'd name my web viewer if that was relevant. I'd define my function in text. There it is. And then I define my parameters as an array, 40 and 2. We want 40 to be added, 2 and 40 to be added together. You'll get back in the result property the result, and then obviously the error information, if there is any. I want to highlight that you can pass functions as parameters. All parameters in FileMaker, ultimately, when FileMaker is performing JavaScript in a web viewer, all the parameters are strings. So passing functions is difficult to do. It's how do you discern a function from a string? The way we've decided to discern it is using this little character, which is if you hold Option F on your keyboard, this will come out, and this is saying, hey, treat this as a function, not as a string or a number or an object. So you'll see here, this is a slightly more complex function. It takes 3 parameters. The last parameter is a function, and the function runs on the result of the first, adding the first 2. So in this case, we're adding 40 and 2. Our function is saying take a number n, which is 40 plus 2, times it by 2. So you'll see our result is 84. I won't go into the code route because we're low on time. So yeah, just wanted to highlight that kind of utility function is available in bzBond as well. I think it's a fairly neat implementation, because it does mean it abstracts away a lot of the complexities of JavaScript that you don't want to know about, and it lets you just use get script result. It uses a bit of trickery to let you do that. Okay, and then let's move on to the final thing, which is just to highlight server-side JavaScript and that it's available, how it's available. So we have an option for basically a product called bzBond Server, which is part of the open source tools, which is a microservice framework that enables JavaScript in FileMaker scripts on the server. Now, that means explicitly you have to install it on your server, so you have to have access to your server to install it. It's easy to install if you have that root access. Again, we'll go over to the README. It's just a single command to install and a single command to uninstall. Currently, we have Mac OS and Linux instructions. The web team are working on Windows right now. But yeah, the idea is you install this little agent, which is essentially a microservice. It's a Node app on your server, and then that is what gets called when you're running JavaScript on the server. The alternative way is, as we saw, to use the bbox plugin and then flag that when you run your script. You might be wondering, why would I use one over the other? You basically would use the bzBond server microservice if you don't want to install a plugin on your server, or if you want to extend that microservice to use other microservices you've made. I won't go into that because it's detailed, but you can define other microservices within bzBond server, or if you have a Windows server, because bbox is not supported on Windows. Yeah, and as I say, we have documentation for Windows Server installation in progress. The reason to use bbox would be you're okay installing a plugin on your server. You don't want to install an additional app on your server machine for whatever reason. But do note that, as I've said, bbox is not supported on Windows Server. So Windows Server bzBond server is your only option. Okay, so just to reiterate, or maybe for the first time, just clarify how the support for bzBond, so it's supported platform-wide in some form or other, so it includes WebDirect, it includes FileMaker Go. You may see some quirks in Direct and Go. We haven't done as much testing or deployment, although we have done some. More on WebDirect than Go. There are certainly differences to how web viewers are handled in WebDirect and FileMaker Go, but you should be able to use bzBond across the platform. And obviously on the server side, web viewers don't exist, but we do have that support for server-side JavaScript through either the bbox plugin or the microservice. So yeah, it's obviously not the same as having a web viewer, but it does what you need it to do. And just to be clear, the reason you might want server-side JavaScript is obviously for your automated processes, or if you're calling processing scripts from stuff like the data API or OData, and obviously scheduled scripts. Okay, so we had this diagram before about the kind of categorization of web integration tools. Adding bzBond into that now, you'll see that it kind of goes across the full categories. So as I said at the beginning, it is an end-to-end tool set, and just adding in this last one that it's in the plugins area because it does wrap bbox, which in turn wraps Node. So it abstracts away all that for you, so you don't have to worry quite so much about it. And finally, I just want to highlight bzBond is open source software, and we're serious about that. So we would love to see people raising issues, forking the library, forking the repos, and raising PRs. Though I do have to check the permissions if just anyone can raise PRs or not, but in principle, we're in support of that. It's maintained by a team, not just by one person. So that's just to say that, you know, it's not going to go away if, say, I got involved with a bus, and it's in production in a lot of enterprise and non-enterprise solutions. So again, it's something that is building up a kind of institutional support base in beeswax, and obviously we'd love that to grow in the wider community. But yeah, it's something creating value for us, and our hope is that it can create value for others too. Ooh, do I have anything else? Oh yeah, so to find it, you can just search bzBond. It's great. GitHub has good SEO, so if you just put that into Google, you should find the main repo. Okay, this is pretty much the end. So we saw what was possible with web UI with JavaScript in FileMaker. We had a look at the kind of technology and state of web integrations with Claris. We defined something called the web integration cycle and described it. We then used that as a hook to explore bzBond. We looked specifically at how to use JavaScript and FileMaker scripts with bzBond. We again zoomed in even further to look at serve to specifically flag that you could do server-side JavaScript. We looked at bzBond's place in the DevTool ecosystem. And the last thing I want to mention, some handy links, although something annoying has happened and the main link is coming up last. So yeah, bzBond, that's the repo link. It's a mono repo, so it's got small tools within it. Makes it easier for us to manage. bzBees, if you want, you can download the app that was in the video if you want to sort of see what a integration looks like. I'd recommend that if you're curious. It's a very small app. It's got some cool little things in it. The JavaScript is rough, but it's realistic, right? It's what you may well. It's in the style of someone starting out, for sure. If you want to just learn more about web technologies in general, the JavaScript info is probably the most thorough and useful tutorial I found on JavaScript. Not for the faint-hearted. I haven't finished it, but you know, it's almost like a reference, and it's got little tasks and exercises you can do. Google have they own web.dev. They have some good learning resources. They were made by, you know, really high up web standards people. I don't know if people are aware of Rachel Andrews. She's a British person, but she is heavily involved in those, so they're good quality. And Git, as I said, it's hard to learn. It's worth learning. I've just put like the simplest tutorial I could find, just so you can kind of see the principles. And most Git tutorials are for computer science, I guess, students, because they're very involved, and you kind of like, you don't want to waste your time on them, you feel, but it's worth learning at least the basics. And there is a Git front end from GitHub, which means you don't even have to learn commands. Okay, so that is all I have slides-wise. I'm sorry for going on so long, but nobody stopped me. So whose fault is that really? But happy to take any questions anyone has, or just discuss anything in this area. Last slide. This was me, and this was the presentation. Cool. So yeah, if you need to email me or get me on LinkedIn, those are my details.
Well, yeah, most people are like, well, where to begin?
Where to begin?
Jay was like, make sure you do put some code in there. And I was like, you don't even know.
Well, the GitHub I took a peek over there. It looks like all the code's over there, right? And plus with the sample.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. So yeah, this has been in chain for a long time. And yeah, we've tried to make it as approachable as possible, given the fact that it is, you know, it's a fairly big product. There's a lot. Yeah, I don't know how many people are like, I don't know what the mix of people between using web integrations already, like interested in web integrations is. It's really hard to get a sense of it. But yeah, if anyone has any general questions about getting started or more detailed questions about stuff they have, I'm happy to chat about that as well. It doesn't specifically have to be about bzBond.
I'd be curious what Jeremy's comments or questions would be on it, because he's the one person I know that would know enough to ask the right questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking, obviously I don't want to speak for you, Alec, and volunteer you for anything, but I almost think that it might be helpful for anybody who wants to do it and not familiar with all these things, if there would be like some kind of office hour thing that you could do, and it could be recorded once to walk through the process of getting it actually all configured and set up, and then walk through an end-to-end example. And then once it's recorded, then, you know, people can refer to that, because there's a lot of material here to cover and the depth of it and everything, and or just grab your JavaScript buddy and say, hey, come over here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, you know, if you're working with web devs, you can just get some traction just by showing them the library, and that they may be like, okay, I can work with this. But obviously, yeah, I'm happy to do any, you know, an end-to-end sort of fully worked example. I don't think you could do it in one office hours. You probably want to do it as a series of videos, I think, so as not to bite off too much at once.
Looks like Brian has a question.
Hey, great presentation. I'm starting to do a lot of work with APIs through different various sources and having to share data between one API, refactor the data and send it to another API, pull it back. Would this be something, a lot of times they have the SD kits that they already have that come with the API documentations for the various APIs I connect to. Would this be something I could tie that into to do the API logic using their SD kits? Because it would probably perform better than doing the native parsing in FileMaker, because the JSON parsing in FileMaker is really slow.
Thank you, Brian, for that question. That is exactly the sort of question I want. Yes, you absolutely would be able to use SDKs with bzBond. The path you would probably want to use is one of the few things I didn't cover fully, which is you would probably want to make your own microservice, I'd have thought, and call that through bzBond server. And then you could basically, you would write a little bit of JavaScript using those SDKs, and then you send the parameters, you know, you send the API output, say, to that endpoint on your service, on the microservice, and it would do the interaction with the API without FileMaker. So yeah, your JavaScript code could drive that, and you would just really be using FileMaker as the intermediary to, you know, grab code from different APIs, and then you'd just be passing it to your little your other little services you write. So yeah, bzBond as a microservice framework is a thing. We'll have some more documentation about it. But yeah, that's definitely what you're doing. I've definitely been in your shoes. You know, modern APIs are really great, so you can usually use just insert from URL, right, and use them. But if you need to do a lot of data processing, if you need to do some more advanced things, then yeah, like, you know, companies like Box, for example, they have an SDK, and in order to leverage that, you need some sort of, usually a server-based environment, and bzBond can be that environment on the server. So yeah, if you want to email me, and then I can let you know when the kind of documentation and some examples for writing those little microservices are available.
Awesome, yeah, because what I run into a lot is like right now I'm working with the Miva merchant, and it's a fireworks company, and their products list is 5 megabytes worth of text. And crunching that in native JSON in FileMaker takes a long time. Now Monkey Bread does it in really quick, but then I gotta, you know, deal with the table structure that Monkey Bread does with the JSON import. So I was looking to use the microservice, and I think this is kind of the route I want to take for all my API work moving forward, and not have it do the native FileMaker and use the microservice.
Yeah, that's definitely an intended use. So you would be supported in that endeavor for sure.
Awesome. Great presentation. Love it.
Thanks, Brian.
There's another question from Sam. Does bzBond support TypeScript?
Does it support TypeScript? It's definitely not written in TypeScript, so I guess no. But yeah, so my feelings of TypeScript are kind of ambivalent. I understand why you would use it, but I don't think it necessarily is I think you could use, if you had a TypeScript app, you could use bzBond because it's compatible in that way. But bzBond itself does not have any TypeScript code in it. So yeah, maybe I'm missing something about how that might be an issue in some scenarios, but we can, if you want to expand on that, please do. Yeah, I'm keen to learn TypeScript, but at the same time, I'm not entirely convinced of its value in smaller projects like bzBond.
I got another question for you, Alec. A lot of times I'm dealing with security concerns with APIs. What kind of security we have with this microservice, and what kind of handshaking are we doing kind of in the background?
Mm-hmm. That's another great question, and I did wonder if anyone would mention that. I didn't want to go into details in the presentation. It's niche. So the way the microservice works is it's completely isolated from the outside world. It essentially will only work locally, unless, I guess, you've accidentally opened your firewall to the port it uses. It's essentially an internal Node app. And for people who are here who work for Claris or who are familiar with the architecture of FileMaker Server, it's actually very similar to a lot of components within FileMaker Server. A lot of FileMaker Server components are accessed via various ports in the FileMaker Server. They're just web apps that are never exposed to outside. And they're used for inter-app communication. So bzBond Server is essentially a custom additional one of those. By default, it uses port 8999. It's not super easy to change that port, as in I'd love it to be easier, but we will develop it to make it easier to use a different port because there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to. And yeah, you can't call it from the outside unless you've intentionally opened a port on the firewall. And even then, I'm not sure if it would work. Depends on your environment. So essentially, the way your FileMaker script gets around that kind of that isolation is that it can do a call via local host because it's the server, right? So it has local host. So if it goes to port 899 on the local host, it will be able to access the service. But if just Joe Bloggs on your network tries the IP address and then the port number, they will not get a response. So I don't think there's a security concern because it's not designed to be. It's not a generic microservice that you're supposed to hit from a web app, for example. It's supposed to be isolated to FileMaker Server only.
Awesome, thank you.
Oh, and just to add, bzBond Node is of course as secure as a FileMaker plugin. So if you're using our bbox for, if it's the same as using any other plugin, there's no network security concern in that case.
Brian, did you have another question?
Thinking of one.
Your hand was up still.
Oh, my apologies.
He wants to ask more questions.
It's just like a standing.
API work is it's the future of FileMaker, I think, with all things connected. And I think I'm working with our current web developer to build our own microservices, but may not waste his time after seeing this presentation, maybe look into doing this and joining this foray into seeing if we could leverage what's already here.
Fantastic. And yeah, I mean, I think, again, you're supported here in that endeavor. I'm hoping the platform as well is going in that direction. Obviously, there's Claris Connect, which has sort of mainstream connectors, but there's also the custom connector. So, you know, in the future, when maybe solutions are more cloud-based, you could essentially also build your own microservice with Claris Connect. So yeah, you're right that APIs are where the industry and where Claris is heading. It's a good road to be on, I think.
Okay. I think you spellbound them, Alec. I'm sure we'll have follow-up, you know, and Alec, you're presenting at some other user groups as well. So
yes.
Your presentation will evolve, yeah, so more to come.
Yeah, and please, I don't present very often, so I will happily take any feedback offline about style or content. Don't be shy, because yeah, I'll be doing a few of these, and I'd love to improve as I go.
Cool.
You may want to work on your accent, I think.
What? Does it need to be more British or less British?
Yeah, I think you get it almost down though.
Eric, any closing thoughts?
No, it was good. Yeah, it's been a while since we've had some JavaScript on here, and I think it's great to see it evolving in the community.
Yeah. Jeremy, you've been pretty quiet. I know you do a lot of JavaScript. Any thoughts, comments on your end?
Oh, hey, no, I've been dealing with dogs in the rain or storms. No, I think, you know, the eternal question that people have is where is the code going to be stored? I think bzBond is handling it the same way that I'm choosing to do, but there's thousands of other places, and it's, you know, we've stopped arguing about primary keys, and now we're arguing about where to store HTML and CSS code. So I'm glad that's a great evolution, in my opinion, to argue about something else other than primary keys. I think you're storing it you're storing it in a text field, right? Is that what it was when it was all collapsed?
Exactly.
Right, Alec?
Yeah, it's a text field. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm having a discussion with someone in my JS and FM community about how to actually store it and then how to access it and so forth. So there's a lot of possibilities, and you know, that's going to be the next big discussion, I think.
Well, what are the other alternatives?
Well, I've seen people store it in layout objects that are in layout mode only. I've seen people use custom
Matt
functions.
did that, right? Matt Petrosky was doing that? Like,
yeah, Matt Petrosky does that.
Mm-hmm.
I see custom functions. I see the code being stored in custom functions. I can't remember how Craft does it, but you know, it's got to be stored somewhere. So unfortunately, we don't have. At one time, I was asking Claris, can we get some sort of like hidden tables or something that are not accessible by any schema, or they're not even there. They're just some place we can store code. But those are the main ways.
Sweetie, had a great day. Good driving today.
But somebody is suggesting that on my community that we actually store the separate files in container fields, and then when they are accessed, they're just exported to the user's desktop. or they're to a temporary place with a temporary path and access there, so you're not minifying the code. So I don't know. It's an interesting discussion.
I don't know.
That
It seems
was
like
actually our initial approach, was that I had a whole like interface for storing N files. It was pretty nice. But yeah, it does open up a few security issues, as in it doesn't stop you opening security holes yourself. It's not like insecure by default, but it creates those. And it's not super modern, right? You have this build process.
Yeah.
It's there. Oh, I know people, but interestingly, people are moving away from builds now, which is interesting. So maybe the like individual files thing will come back. But yeah, it's interesting. But then you kind of think, why don't you just store those files on a web server?
Right. I actually did that for the first time recently. I spun up. I use Vercel to host my websites and deploy from GitHub, and I recently put some code up there to just test how that works, and then just link to it in the files. What I like, obviously, in modern JavaScript development is all of the code when you do an import using npm and you install it and then you import it into your file. It's all contained in there, right? And so when it gets packaged up, inside of a FileMaker field, it can be totally offline, and there's no need to reach out to the internet. So for some people, that's a good appeal. For others, it doesn't matter because the file is already hosted. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, it's, every day I think I'm rethinking things. The development environment that I have is how Todd and I built those add-ons, and I've just kind of simplified it and made it a little bit more approachable. And for me it works, but I'm interested to play with bzBond and see how it does too. So yeah,
that's interesting. That's interesting because you say it's from building the add-ons.
Yeah,
that makes perfect sense. Whereas we came from basically delivering just whatever clients needed, so much bigger. Just the client would say something, you'd have to deliver it. So that's how we built our development environment. But they don't seem like they're a million miles off each other. Really.
Yeah, you could take either environment and you could build an incredible web widget with it using React, using Tailwind, using any sort of React libraries. At least I assume that you could do that with bzBond, because it's just building it all, and so
exactly, yeah.
It's not limiting. There's no limit to what we can do with either environment and such. So, yeah, I'm interested in exploring it. And seeing how it could work. But yeah, it's.
I'm on FM Slug now, so we can always chat on there too.
I think learning JavaScript is important. In fact, that's what I'm trying to do to the community and get that out there, and because they can't use either of our environments if we don't know JavaScript, right? So we need to learn some of the JavaScript at least to get started. And you mentioned some things, and I bring up things in my course and all that. But yeah, it's interesting and good. I've looked at it. I haven't played with it yet, but we'll get to that. But yeah.
I think as you all start to maybe discuss this even more in the community, I'm hoping that Claris might come around and say, oh, maybe we can add this that will, kind of like, again, it's always these little steps forward, right, that give us some opportunity to improve things and add to make things better. So who knows?
And beeswax is coming from a little bit different angle. I have a little bit different approach, but what I'm interested in the most is that somehow we just get all the word out there, whatever it is, whatever approach it is, that the word is out there, that people see all the great examples, and people are able to pick the option that works for them. And you know, I'm trying to build a community around JavaScript and FileMaker. It's a little bit more skewed towards the approach that I've been using, but I'm trying to separate it just a little bit. But I think I'll always have a little bit of bias. But I really want more discussions about JavaScript. I don't want to argue about primary keys anymore. Just let's argue about JavaScript stuff. That's where I'm at. Tired of arguing about that stuff. You know. So.
Cool.
Yeah. Join my community, Alec. I'd love for you to be a part of it.
Yeah. What? I'm definitely aware of it.
It's in the chat there.
Just to go to JS. Oh, it's in the chat. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
We do have good discussions there. We do have an office hour, so you and I can talk maybe, and maybe, I don't know if you guys want to join my office hours.
What is your office hours?
I do an office hours like 9:30 Pacific, 9:30 Eastern time, and I'm going to start doing it 3:30 Eastern time on Wednesdays. It's a good time. We chat, and Ben is part of it, and it's fun to discuss this. He's the one who brought us up and reminded us about this, so I'm glad he did in our last talk. It's just talking about JavaScript, so.
I see it. Yeah, it looks cool. Nice.
Usually I don't have anything to talk about. I can't think of any subject, but by the time we get going, there's plenty to talk about. So it's good. Yeah, join us if you can.
Yeah, I'm signing up now, so I'll join.
And please,
9:30 Eastern's good for me. For sure.
Alec, please post about bzBond in there. It's not just about the stuff that I produce, but feel free to put a post in there about beeswax's bzBond, and just let the members know that they can explore that too.
Sorry, I'm just signing up. I'm signed up.
Great. Oh, just got the email. Cool. Thanks for this.
Yeah, no, it's great to. Yeah, I'm keen to connect with others because beeswax is just about big enough that you can just do all your kind of chat within beeswax, but it's nice to. Yeah, I definitely want to go beyond and connect with other communities.